InEight helps companies avoid project surprises, make better informed decisions, share knowledge, and deliver better outcomes. InEight, transforming the way the world builds.
Hello, project people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. It's always good to have you with us. And it's back with Mr. Dale. We finally made an episode where we were both present and free. How are you, Dale?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Val. It's good to be on the podcast with you again. It's been a little while. I think we've been trying to dodge each other for some reason, but we won't share that on the air, right? We won't air our dirty laundry.
No, I had to go back and listen to a few guests because I missed a few good subjects and topics, but I thought they were great episodes. And look, we've got another one in front of us today with Dr. Alexia Nalewaik. How are you, Alexia? Welcome back.
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
I love it when we have podcasts with people from all over the world. So we've got three countries represented here, which is fantastic: Australia, the UK, and the US, and a good time to do that. So we're all about alliances here. And you've been on our show before, episode 57, Critical Thinking. I think that was a fantastic episode. For those that have not actually listened to Alexia before, she's fantastic to listen to. Please check out that episode. But I'm really interested in this topic as well, because I think we've seen a movement over perhaps the last couple of years since I've been acknowledged or aware of it, but certainly towards social responsibility and other ways of measuring the success of a project. I think we've gone down the route of the iron triangle. We know that's important, but is it the only thing that is important? And I think evaluating projects for different ways of how they contribute to the community is really, really important as well. And we were just talking about that before we press record. And I love that concept. And so before we get into the detail, we always like to step it back and really keep a baseline. And so I think from our perspective, just because we're a bunch of idiots, Dale and I, Alexia, and we don't know what we're talking about. So we have people like you to tell us what the truth is. What does social value mean? When they say social value, what are they really trying to get at?
There are a number of different definitions of social value, and depending on who you're with or what group is studying it, it might be called social value or societal value. And there are all kinds of communities of thought over what social means, or socialism, and societal versus society. So there's really not a cohesive definition in the built environments, which is what I'm in. And the general concept is some type of benefit to society. But when you look at your typical social value project metrics, very often it boils down to, oh yeah, we're providing more jobs. And that's not what we're looking at here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, I think if it's I think the word is politicized. We have these big projects that become politicized, and then for politicians, particularly in Australia, I'm not sure what the US and the UK are like, it's all about job growth and economy growth, and I think it misses the mark for a lot of these projects. And I know for the projects you're talking about, you've done some projects that are more isolated from, let's say, big city type projects, but I think ROI criteria and just benefits management in general is quite a weak spot in projects that I've worked on. It's kind of an afterthought halfway through the project. I think, we should probably articulate what the business benefits might be before we get asked, and that's a bit troubling, actually. I've seen that on a few projects. But if we talk about return on investment, I think that's an interesting area to cover. How do you go about preparing something like that, or for social value or for ROI on a project? Is it something you see that's done at the start, or do you see projects kind of retrospective fitting this?
I think we're all familiar with the return on investment challenge, right? Which is that benefits tend to be overstated, or your cash back tends to be overstated, and initial cost tends to be understated, which is why so many projects right at the start have appeared to have gone over budget. Now, looking at return on investment, or rather a discussion with stakeholders perhaps about value to the community, I find that that tends to occur in community forums or as part of the press and outreach by a project. And it isn't done very, very early in the project. It's done during that stakeholder engagement period, or when you have community members, right, complaining about an upsurge in traffic and how everybody's parking, near their front drive or something. So a lot of that outreach and talk about what a project can do for the community occurs, in my experience, a little bit later. So it's part of managing stakeholders and trying to dampen some outcry and pushback about a project. And generally it tends to promise maybe a community can use the building for some purpose, or promises maybe an added shuttle service or jobs to be created, something like this. And so we see a very standard narrative, I think, in terms of community benefit when it comes to capital projects. Whereas what we're looking at is a group of, I hate to say metrics, but a group of qualities that can be perhaps looked at very early in the process and included as part of a more traditional project benefits calculation. I personally would love to see this become, once we turn this into some sort of methodology, I'd love to see this turn into a way for projects to truly be formally evaluated before they're undertaken.
Yeah, that I agree with you. I would love to see the same thing. Maybe we can ask, or at least inquire a bit about what you've been doing over the last couple of months, is it, or years, working around this ROI criteria piece. Where did you start? How did you get involved in it?
So all this started with Dr. Nigel Williams at University of Portsmouth. And he's part of the Responsible Project Management Group, and he approached me at a conference in Germany and asked if I would like to look at social value from an audit perspective. And in my usual fashion, I said, sure, why not? Which has gotten me into plenty of trouble during my life. So he and I started doing some research, kicking it around, looking at it. And I happened to be in a position where I had access to a number of sort of big science projects. So radio telescopes, space science projects, these sorts of things. And those tend to be located in very remote areas that are deep in history and culture, but also tend to have some existing population that might be a little lower on the economic totem pole, right? I can even point to Australia and South Africa and communities where they didn't necessarily have the greatest telecommunications service. They might not have had reliable power. And so in the course of the past 2 years, we've spoken with over 20 of these space science facilities and actually inquired about how the mere construction of the facility, the mere existence of the facility has changed life in that community, in that region, or even in that country.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And with regard to, I guess, understanding the social value, is there any tools that you use, or is it really just trying to get the metrics or the measures right first before we go into tools and trying to automate or develop systems that could be used on other projects?
Right. At the moment, we aren't using any particular tools. We're working with project data, such as is available, and a lot of interviews. So we've gone back. We've actually spoken with with people who were involved with telescopes in Australia back 40 years ago, or the Very Large Array in the United States, or in Equatorial Launch, which is fairly new in Australia, and the Canberra Deep Space Communications Complex. I've been speaking with people in Ghana and South Africa, the Square Kilometre Array, and the Netherlands. It's been just an amazing group of people who we've had the privilege of working with and speaking with this about this. And what we're noticing is that there's no standard for data capture on this topic, and there's really there's no funding specific to this sort of data capture. So certain organizations do, I'd say, a better job than others, but it's of their own volition, or it might be in response to a government request. Otherwise, with some of the other facilities, you kind of have to really dig deep and go through a lot of data in order to capture what you're looking for. So there's no particular standard. It would be lovely to see a standard of reporting about these sorts of benefits.
I think that's where it all starts, right, Alexia? When there is nothing, when there isn't a data source, when there is no standard, you got to start somewhere, right? And I guess in place of nothing, interviews are the logical place to start with the people that worked on them. What did you do? And, collecting all of that. I wonder if I put on the devil's advocate hat again and say, well, how do you get around bias when you talk to people and interview people? Because surely they have their certain view on how things were. And how do you sort of wade through all of that?
And that's the beautiful thing about talking about these sorts of facilities, where they pretty much require long-term community commitments and land use agreements. You have significant civil infrastructure that has been put in place specific to that project. So there's really no arguing about whether or not that road was there before, right? And the growth and a self-sustaining economy development is really easy to point to. So if you look at the life cycle of a major science facility in a very rural area, where roads might not be paved, where bus service might not be as frequent. And next thing you know, all of a sudden there's reliable power. There's sewerage installed, there's fast communications fiber, roads have been paved and are being maintained, and a whole bunch of other civil works that go with it, right? You can really just point to that and say, if it weren't for this facility, that wouldn't be here. And those roads aren't just a short hop from a freeway. Those roads are often a fairly long drive from the nearest, even minor city. So the local community immediately gets to use all those roads, right? Whereas before they were riding on a dirt track or something. Then you see facilities start to be constructed. So when we talk about facilities, yes, we're talking about a research facility, but also there are a number of ancillary buildings, such as accommodation and maintenance shops and fire safety, security, data centers and data storage, visitor centers very often put in place as well. So we're talking about a lot of buildings, which then means a lot of need for staff, right? Pardon me. Then you start seeing not just staff hired during construction, and often locals given trained in skills trades. Those turn into short-term jobs, but those individuals then go on and take those new skills to go on to other employment once construction is finished. In the next phase with operations, you see not just people being hired at the facility, but you see all this need for maintenance and housekeeping and all sorts of other regular services, So you don't end up with just jobs at the facility, but what you see are locals creating new companies, hiring people, serving that particular facility, and then starting to serve other clients as well.
You're okay there?
I am okay there.
Good, good.
So you start to create this massive supply and value chain. So local individuals who start developing perhaps a company to provide spare parts and small tools and all sorts of things that that particular facilities needs. You have not just a highly intelligent, highly educated population moving in, but you have their families, their wives, their children, maybe their husbands and their children, right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And then also visitors who are also very highly educated. They're going to put additional demands on local healthcare, local security and police and fire department, local schools, everything from K through 12 to university to postgraduate, trade schools, community colleges. So the education infrastructure starts building and growing. You start seeing first generation people finishing high school and then graduating college, going to university, getting a graduate degree, coming back home, filling spaces in the university as teachers. And then once all those slots are filled, starting to develop partnerships with major organizations, especially telecommunications, where telecommunications is trying to get a foothold in the area and expand service. So all of a sudden you have this new crop of engineers that are all locals who've come back home, and now you're seeing a boost in other industries. All sorts of other things tend to happen in the town. So if we're looking from a generational perspective, you start to see growth of arts and culture, or rather the sort of in a physical sense, shops and community centers that are on a much bigger scale than existed before. Space tourism, and to accompany that, hotels, guest houses, restaurants. I mean, we're talking about a massive impact to the economy that goes well beyond anything that is usually mentioned when a project like this is proposed. That they usually talk all about the research that will be generated, possible commercialization of what's developed, government applications, obviously jobs. But it's comparatively rare for an organization to make the effort up front and say, we're going to transform this economy and this is how. And it's going to take 3 generations to do it. So it's absolutely amazing to watch the transformation of an area due to all of this. And yes, there can be value destruction, right? Your construction always comes with value destruction, right? You've taken a piece of land that had a different kind of purpose. There may be endangered species. You may have put some people out of work by acquiring their farm. But another thing that we see is that the organizations tend to not just compensate for that, but really above and beyond compensate. So we see a huge new focus on environmental. We see a big focus on really transforming in existing industries. So moving from maybe communal grazing to a centralized feedlot for farm animals. And this is the sort of thing that we saw in South Africa with the square kilometer array.
Wow, I was actually going to ask you that, what sort of risks or adverse effects there are to growth in this way, and how perhaps things like circular economies fit in with this as well, because carbon emissions is a huge thing we're looking at in projects today, and I just wonder if that's taken into consideration as well when you measure the social impact, because there's positives and negatives, as you say.
Yes.
What are some of the downsides that you are measuring when you look at some of the data?
Some of it is job loss or resources loss. Some of it is simply interruption of business as is. And of course, there's a very strong environmental and ecological impact as well. But for some of these facilities, really what we're talking about is an antenna in the middle of nowhere. So its footprint isn't that huge. And actually on some projects, because there is a certain amount of distance that's preferred, shall we say, you don't want people climbing all over your antenna or whatever with your space science equipment, right? So yes, there are boundaries established, especially in radio astronomy, where the mere proximity of a cell phone can really disrupt technical measurements. There have been actual wildlife refuges created. So you're creating actually a national park. It just happens there's a telescope or two in there. And that ends up being actually a benefit for the country to have a national park established. One other thing that was really fascinating is that when we talk about research output from major science facilities, the research output that we talk about very often focuses on the core mission of that facility. So people studying physics, we talk about the physics benefits, but in truth, when you're looking at development in a very, very rural area, and the fact that all of a sudden there's a facility with offices, with actually some accommodation and possibly some food, it starts attracting a whole different kind of researchers. So everything from archaeoastronomy to anthropology and paleontology, archaeology, oceanography and atmospheric studies, endangered species and biodiversity, all of this suddenly becomes possible because there's the beginnings of some infrastructure there that can support researchers, even if they're not of the core mission of the facility.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, I know you're working with Dr. Nigel, and we've had him on the podcast as well with Dr. Karen Thompson, episode 73, talking about responsible project management. And it probably goes without saying that, working with him, that's a big part of a big angle, I guess, you're looking at this with as well through that lens. But I wonder if we bring it down to Val and I's geek speak around metrics and data, because we're controls folk, as you know. Have you nailed down any KPIs or metrics that you sort of can put out there and go, this is a KPI that you can sort of start looking at, or a target that you can start talking about upfront going into a project before you've even got any approvals in place or anything like that? Is that something that you've nailed down yet?
What we can measure is what has happened. So we can measure number of new hotels created,
Yep.
Number of businesses created. We can look at the economic growth in an area on a decadal basis, right? And of course, not 100% of that will be due to the facility, but a lot of it will. So there are things that can be quantified. Number of tourists to a location, number of people visiting the visitor center, these sorts of things. And then there are some things that are a little tougher to quantify, or rather harder to track down, right? So this whole concept of generational change in education, number of people, number of new students graduating high school, that's measurable. And then trying to track those students once they go on from a local school is a bit tough, but there are some numbers around how many of them come back with a university degree, how many start a new business, or what kind of new technology or engineering type work is appearing, you know, sort of not so much administrative or hospitality, but what sort of jobs have been created in more technical fields like telecommunications. And so it's fascinating work, and there's, I would say, no two facilities are the same, but the big picture is that there are a number of similarities which could be considered at the time of project proposal. So it's possible to say, if you have a 50-year, a lot of this equipment, a lot of these facilities are expected to last 25 years. They tend to vastly outlive their stated life, because once you've made an investment in something like this, it's tempting to keep adding more technology to it and keep it going, right? Until you reach project failure. And in some of these projects, project failure can be pretty dynamic and tends to show up on the news. So if you look up front and you're able to say, in considering this project, let's consider more than profit. Let's consider more than space or scientific research or number of jobs. Let's start talking about how this can fundamentally change a community. How can, let's say, birth survival rates increase? How can general health of the community increase? How can we measure a change in the economy that's not just due to jobs, that's due to new business creation and tourism and connecting this community to other communities via all this research and all this traffic. So it's actually really nice to look at a community that previously had very limited bus service that now has very regular bus service, plus a train, plus a whole bunch of other stuff, right? They're really, life's becoming easier, and there are a lot more services available. And I don't think we really discuss at that level just how much better the fire department is going to be, or how much better the police department, or how much more effective the police department might be. The people who tend to be employed at these facilities are very community minded. And so we see volunteer firefighters, volunteer emergency technicians. We see all sorts of staff members and family members teaching and at the schools and in the universities. We see them giving back to the community. So if you look at, for example, Green Bank Observatory here in West Virginia, extremely rural area, known for having literally just one radio station that's very, very limited, because they're protecting, part of it is they're protecting the telescope from noise. But in times of emergency, the Green Bank Telescope campus is available to the community. We've sheltered people in the past if there's a big storm. There's been all sorts of service provided to the community in emergencies, providing food and supplies. And it's really amazing to see that it's not just, ooh, we're dropping a facility here and you'll get jobs. It's, we're dropping something here that's going to become not just an integral part of the community, but also even a cultural touch point for the entire area. So it's fascinating, it's very different from, say, what you might be able to measure dropping a manufacturing plant in the middle of Los Angeles.
No, absolutely.
Not sure that's a cultural touch point. And no, plus I don't think there's going to be tourism.
I can see how it's really, really difficult to actually quantify some of the things you're talking about. And I wonder then, maybe, is this as close as we'll get to, in its purest form, lessons learned or lessons shared, indeed, to say, look at what's happened in the past by doing this. If we can use that as a blueprint and do that again, by default, you will get the same or very close to the similar outcomes as a result. And perhaps you use that as a blueprint to say, you know, we might not be able to say, based on this project in this location, you will get X, but based on historical evidence we've got, you'll near as damn it get these types of outcomes for the community. So that's exciting within itself, because the project world is notoriously poor at sharing lessons, sharing from failures, particularly, but I guess even more so learning from successes. And often you spoke about failure there as well. It's what is your success criteria, right? And if your success criteria is building this telescope to last 25 years, well, then that's just one aspect. But if your success criteria is broader and all of these social benefits you're talking about there, then perhaps and again, it's difficult to measure, but it's outcome based, right? It's outcome based. But anyway, look, I want to bring Val back into this as well. Val, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a few comments I was thinking about there when you mentioned biodiversity and creating almost like an ecosystem around these projects, which I'd never really thought about before, actually. And it reminded me of, it was actually in the US. Did you ever watch that documentary around how wolves change rivers? And they were talking about natural systems, and they reintroduced wolves back into the Yellowstone National Park.
Oh,
and
wait, I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what happened was, I mean, they expected things to change, but what they didn't realize it was going to change the entire trophic cascade. It changed the landscape, the climate, everything. And so they had this documentary, and it reminded me of how small changes to ecosystems can have a big impact. And the wolves changed the behavior of the deer. This means that the rivers and the banks could revegetate, stabilize the river, have there more pools, and it changed the microclimate of the entire national park, which I thought was incredible. A great documentary for anyone who wants to live it, but a great story as well, how wolves change rivers. And, you know, maybe it's how projects change society, you know, that there's some transference to that, where if we can introduce the right types of projects, we can have massive social benefits and social climate changes where we build in an ecosystem that is sustainable as well. And I thought that was a really nice thought that just come to my mind, Alexia, because I think that's what you were talking about, where it doesn't just impact the local people. There's a generational impact if it's a long enough project, and that could be a wealth of ideas, and those ideas get manufactured, come back into the community. Those ideas could help all of us. You know, they could be the next who knows what, and change the world, in fact. And I thought about that as well, and building these environments around science in particular, because that's a great topic as well. We don't talk about enough projects in the science space, Dale. We should definitely get some more guests on, Alexia, so if you know anyone, let us know. But I'm just thinking out loud and looking at some of these bigger projects, and I know they tend to outlive their use, or at least their assets do. What about projects that do stop? Does that have then an impact on that society or that infrastructure that you've built up for that community around them? Is there a possibility that could go backwards if, you know, you get the ghost towns, you've seen like the old mining booms where you've had an influx of infrastructure and people and community, and then the reason for them being there, the purpose for them being there, has stopped, and then people are like, well, we'll move to the next town, you know, and you have this shell of what was a great community. Does that ever occur, or is there a way to prevent that or slow that down?
Historically, I think as a community, space science has managed to keep the majority of their facilities going. So when the Green Bank telescope collapsed, it was rebuilt, right? If you look to more recent history, the Arecibo telescope has greatly outlived its planned life, right? But now you have an entire community of researchers and local community as well that have, as I said, it's not just a business, but it's a cultural touch point. It's very much loved. So there's huge discussion going on about what will happen next with that site. And I think the inclination is that there will be some future for it, but who, what, why, you know, that's all yet to be decided. But it's interesting to see with the Arecibo collapse, the discussion around the value of that location, the value to the community, the value to radio astronomy history even.
Mm.
Not to
What do you
mention the
call?
James Bond movies and all that. Yeah.
Of course. Exactly. Big James Bond fan myself. So how do you describe that role? Because I'm trying to think of that particular role around that social value element, the work that you're doing now, in context that it may be before the project starts, or it may be while the project's getting set up, or it might be while the project's in flight. What do you call that role? Is that a new type of role that we're emerging to, or is
It
it something that will be adapted?
is. So that's a really interesting question, because the terminology used for this varies greatly between countries. And so the concept that I've seen on my current projects, the concept is generally EPO, education and public outreach, and broader impacts. But if you look at the traditional definition of broader impacts in the United States, it's very much focused on the science output. And so I would be inclined to try to broaden that definition to include the greater impacts to the community, to society as a whole. I mean, some of these major science facilities are major change at a country level. So we're starting to see with the Ghana telescope and other related telescopes, an actual community of astrophysics and astronomy across Africa. And we're starting to see also a community building that's trying to connect astrotourism to wine tourism to sports tourism, bicycling, going across Africa, and putting the three together to get that synergy going to really boost the economy and options for things to do, right? So there's different terminology used. A lot of it falls under this broader impacts type of umbrella, and the definitions of what that entails differs from organization to organization and country to country. So we see certain countries at the forefront of these concepts, and I'd say those would be the UK, Australia, and South Africa.
Oh,
not to exclude others. There are plenty of others too, but those are the big three where I see research output, I see use of the terminology, and a square kilometer array has gathered more data far above what other organizations have shushed. Great, and my watch is talking to me. Far above what I've seen other projects do. The square kilometer array is collecting data on this that is utterly astounding. And the stories that are told, I have heard so many stories from new staff and scientists to really like old school guys, you know, in their 80s, right? Just telling these fabulous stories about the change they've seen, and they can actually they can name names and say, you know, Joe here, you know, started his own business and in graphics to support our office, and now he has worldwide clients because he's gotten to be so good at graphics or whatever. It's just amazing stories of goodwill and growth and evolution. And so the approach that Nigel and I are taking are really, it's really veering towards an audit lens. And we're looking at 3 phases, really: that immediate value that you get during the construction phase, the medium-term value during the intended phase of operations, and then this extreme, this long tail of value that just keeps, it sort of snowballs. It's really fascinating. So Val, to your point about how wolves change rivers, take a look at the reintroduction of the Tasmanian devil on some small islands off the coast of Tasmania. I just returned from 3 weeks in Tasmania, and those little devils are really quite cute, but there's a fascinating success story that goes with the devils at Cradle Mountain and their reintroduction and rehabilitation and how they're really changing the environment. It's fascinating stuff to look at.
They are very cute, but they make strange sounds. The old Tassie Devils. They had some type of cancer, didn't they, on the nose or something like that was wiping them out.
Yes.
And they didn't know what to do with it, Dale. So they were trying to slow it down or stop it and conserve and separate them somewhat, because I think it was spreading throughout the wild species. But that's fantastic to hear that they're doing some type of rehabilitation program. We love to hear that.
They're doing rehab, breeding, and reintroduction.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love that. And you reminded me, I think when you said you were talking about just the impacts of these elements and how walls change rivers. Now that's the new title, but I think you're right in terms of telecommunications is a big one in Australia in particular. We just rolled out the fiber, and it is actually saying that we can work remotely, and maybe that's the way it's sustained. If we create interesting enough ecologies and environments for people to live in that are science focused or something future focused that enables us to be excited, like astrophysics, which is a great subject. Then you can also have the ability to work from home or work remotely. You can work in these more isolated areas, right?
Looking at Australia, you look back, 10, 20 years, you had the school of the radio in Australia, where there was an entire community or several communities that didn't have adequate telecommunications, didn't have a local school. And so their school was their curriculum was quite literally broadcast over the radio. And thanks to some of the major space science creations there, some of those communities now actually happen to have the fastest internet in all of Australia.
Yeah, they did well.
Possibly faster than yours.
Really? Yeah. Oh, definitely faster than here. I am actually rural at the moment, so I'm about 1.5 hours south of Adelaide, which is okay, but it isn't the fastest. But I was going to ask you a question about just in general, if someone's listening to this, Alexia, and they're inspired by you, and they say, "Well, I'm on a project, and I want to know what the social value of the projects that I'm working on," because we are finding that, especially younger people, they want to know the why, which is a great thing, right? They're very self-conscious around the social contribution of themselves, their carbon footprint, what they eat, where it comes from, the ingredients. I've never started reading the packs of anything until I had kids, and my kids are telling me, "Dad, what's in that? You can't use this, that emulsifier. What is F23? What are these ingredients that are not natural?" And now I have to read. So we're becoming aware of ourselves and our contribution. I think that's affecting who goes on what projects when. And I think that young people are certainly not necessarily going towards the oil and gas. They want to be something that's a bit more contribution to saving the planet. There's a big campaign in schools, and particularly in Australia. How do we pass this on? What is the method in which we would, once you've got this set up, Alexia, what is the intent? Is it something that we can transfer and teach others to apply to other projects? Because that'd be really fascinating.
I would really like to see social value become a prerequisite during the project approvals process. I would love to see that mandated at a government level.
Devil's advocate there. With how they cost is another one that is a prerequisite. You need to put in the business case.
Yes.
But we know how much they understate the cost. Do you think they'd also overstate the social value?
In terms of PR, I wouldn't put it past anyone, but that's really more of a it's really more from I'd say a public relations perspective, right? Or a lobbying perspective. But even just at the grassroots level, I'd like to see a requirement that that project proposals include a discussion of how this might change the region, the good and the bad, value creation and value destruction, just like, 20 years ago with green building certification. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to see how green is your building going to be, and that was part of the project approval process. Why don't we include social value in that as well? I think actually the green building is already a given at this point.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I'd also say I think there's an element for institutes to play a role. Project managers and project professionals do lean on institutes rather than universities a lot. They might get some of their degrees there, but they are really looking to the institutions to provide guidance and support in terms of the best methods to apply on projects. And I think social value is one of them, right?
Yeah. And one thing that was fascinating to me, and it's also interesting to me because it's an example of how siloed we are in academia. We have people on projects who are studying social value on projects. We have people in construction that are doing their thing. And then it turns out there are these entire departments in universities that focus on broader impacts. And I really just want all three to talk to each other.
I completely agree.
There are people getting PhDs in this, in the impacts of projects. And I'm thinking, and also how to speak about projects and the language used when discussing projects, because sometimes this language can almost be a foreign language. How do you convey science projects to a general populace without using jargon? I mean, there are actual entire university departments focused on stuff like this. And if we could somehow put this together with the project management, project research side, and construction and capital project side, I think the world would be for the better.
Yeah, completely agree with you, Alexia. Dale, any more from you, my friend?
Wow, I am inspired. I love your passion, Alexia, and I love the potential of where this will go, because I think it's only the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, to borrow that very old analogy. But I actually do want to make a little bit of space, because last time we spoke to you, you spoke about swimming across the channel. This time you bring something different, roller derby. Now, what is, for those that have no idea, what is roller derby? It's a sport, as you probably guess, listeners, it's a sport, but what is it? How did you get into it? What is the aim of it? Because I've looked at it on YouTube. You sent us a link to have a look at, and I was like, I'm confused. What's the aim of it? Can you take us through it?
Well, okay, so what is roller derby? My goodness. It is a sport that is played on roller skates, and it is played on an oval track. And if you think about, I'll say American football or rugby, the goal is to get the ball, right, past the opposing team to something, a goal or something, right? In this case, the human, the jammer with the star on their hat is the ball. And the goal is to get them past the blockers of the opposing team. And then they do a lap around the oval, and for each opposing team member they pass, they score a point. So that's the goal. That's the goal of a bout. It isn't as violent as what you saw in the 70s. It isn't quite as dramatic as what we saw with the movie Whip It, which was it was largely factual, but they included a lot of stuff from early roller derby, which was much more sort of scripted World Wrestling Federation kind of stuff. So we do still have teams that dress up in outrageous gear and have outrageous names for their players. I am now Lexicon. And it is not quite as violent as you've been led to believe. It's actually now becoming a much safer sport and much more, there's a lot more governance in place, I'd say, a lot more rules in place. You're no longer allowed to elbow somebody in the face. It's possibly not as much fun now. So anyway, but I have taken this up at the ripe old age of 53. So, and most of the other people on the track are in their 20s and possibly 30s. So I am actually in training to become an official.
Wow.
That means I'll be the one in the stripy shirt, standing in the middle, telling people what not to do. and sending people into the sin bin or penalty box. But I do go through training with the rest of the team, so my skate skills are getting to be much better than they were. For a hobby, roller skating that I took up during quarantine, this was sort of a natural next step. I hadn't found a swim team, and I was actually interviewing someone as part of this social value project when she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go. I have to go to roller skating practice." And I said, "You what?" "There are people that do this in a group. I have to go with you." So it turns out that when I first started getting my skate legs back, I was actually with a bunch of roller derby junior members. We're talking 12-year-olds who can literally kick my butt. And then, so when orientation and open call for enrollment happened for a new team in town, I was on the list.
Wow.
And here we are.
That's amazing. I love stories like that. I mean, I never donned roller skates. Back in the day, we had roller blades. But I think roller skates are actually more difficult than one would imagine when you put them on. Because I remember my cousin, girl cousin, she had roller skates rather than roller blades. And she was like, it's more difficult than you think. Val, did you ever don roller skates at all?
I did, but I was more of a skateboarder fan. So I used to make fun of a lot of the roller skaters and the rollerbladers, but it's still fun. I mean, getting out there and wheeling around, there's a lot of freedom into that, and movement as well. It's, you can literally do anything on them, and you do it at a speed as well. I imagine the roller derby is quite fast, Alexia.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's really, there's a lot of struggling in the pack, so there's very little movement, and a lot of people tend to go sort of flying off the rink. But then once a couple of people get going, there's some fast moving people there, and the stuff they can do on their toe stops. Just, I've seen people literally dance right across the floor on the tips of their toes, just not even on the wheels.
Oh, wow.
So I will say the big difference here, though, is that even on my worst day as a swimmer, the worst I ever smelled was I smelled like chlorine. And now I am getting a whole introduction to what sweaty gear is all about, and it is awful.
Yeah, so. I often say I miss the smell of the rugby change room after the match, but anyway, maybe I don't.
Right. So we had a particularly hot day here. It was in the high 90s, but here on the East Coast, it's 90s and humid, which is just horrible. And we've been training on the local high school's basketball court, and they forgot to turn on the air conditioning.
Oh dear.
Oh, it was a lovely day. Yeah. My gear stayed wet for a full week. It was very sad.
Well, look, it certainly sounds like, as you're saying, it's a lot safer these days. So the value creation outstrips the value destruction. Not too many people with broken bones and broken noses anymore, which is a great thing. But look, thank you so much for sharing. We said when we first had you on, we'd love to have you back, and thank you for coming back to share what you're doing, and also sharing your hobbies with us as well. It's great to have the personal side of it as well.
Never boring, huh?
Absolutely, never boring. But before we let you go, Alexia, were there any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say if anybody is interested in reaching out to us and talking about the value that either has occurred or can occur on their projects, we would be more than happy to chat with them. I think this is something that needs to gain momentum, and the sooner the better, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So listeners, take Alexia up on that offer, because it is an amazing offer, because there's probably loads of projects out there that we don't realize are creating the social value. Val, any final thoughts from you?
No, it was great to catch up with you, Alexia, again. If you're ever in Australia, please do reach out. I'm all over the place, so we can catch up for a coffee. But yeah, it was great to talk about everything, and I really think there's a big value point into, I guess, consolidating and understanding for those that are out there who want to get into this. How do they get into it? Where do I find information? Who do I talk to? But I see this area growing more and more as awareness grows. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on again. I appreciate it.
It's been our pleasure, Alexia. Folks, as you've heard, that's all the time we have. But remember, before you go, if you like what you've heard, please do help us pay it forward and share a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to our guest, Dr. Alexia Nalewaik, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Val, it's bye for now.